My name is Magnus, and at 32 years old, I own 5 successful restaurants across Seattle. Food has been my passion since I was tall enough to reach the kitchen counter. But to my family, especially my sister Natalie, I was always just the underachiever who played with food for a living. When Mom turned 60, Natalie organized her birthday dinner at an upscale restaurant. What she never expected was that I owned the place. Before I tell you how my sister tried to humiliate me at my own restaurant, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And hit that like button if you've ever had family underestimate your dreams. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Seattle shaped more than just my accent. Our family had a comfortable life, nestled between the perpetual rain and the smell of coffee that seemed to permeate every corner of the city. My father built his reputation as a corporate lawyer, working 60-hour weeks and wearing his professional success like a badge of honor. My mother taught high school English, her patience with struggling students never quite extending to her own son's unconventional ambitions. From the moment I could stand on a stool beside my mother in the kitchen, I was fascinated by cooking. While other kids my age were playing video games, I was experimenting with spice combinations and watching cooking shows with the intensity most reserved for playoff games. Mom would sometimes smile at my creations, sampling them with genuine curiosity, but always with the subtle reminder that cooking was a hobby, not a career path. "Magnus, this pasta is delicious," she would say. "But remember, you need a real profession to support yourself." The divide in our family was clear from early on. There was the path of academic achievement, professional degrees, and societal respect. Then there was everything else, considered hobbies at best and wastes of potential at worst. My sister Natalie understood this division perfectly and played the game flawlessly. Natalie was 3 years older and seemed to have been born knowing exactly what our parents valued. Her report cards were pristine, her extracurricular activities carefully selected to impress college admissions officers, and her career ambitions perfectly aligned with our father's vision of success. She sailed through an Ivy League undergraduate program and directly into a prestigious law school, never once questioning the path laid before her. "Your sister just made partner at 30, my father announced at a family dinner 2 years ago, his voice swelling with the same pride that had been noticeably absent when I opened my 3rd restaurant. Youngest female partner in the firm's history. The golden child narrative was so deeply ingrained in our family dynamic that neither of my parents seemed aware of it, but Natalie knew. She wielded her status like a weapon, particularly when we were alone. Growing up, she would remind me that I was the family disappointment, the one who would never measure up. As adults, her tactics became more sophisticated but no less cutting. "Still playing with food, Magnus?" she would ask at holiday gatherings, loud enough for relatives to hear. "At least it keeps you off the streets, right?" My decision to pursue culinary arts came during my sophomore year of college. I was drowning in business courses that my father had selected, spending my nights working in restaurant kitchens just to feel alive. The moment of truth arrived over Christmas break when I formally announced my intention to transfer to culinary school. "Absolutely not," my father declared, setting down his fork with a finality that echoed through the dining room. "I will not waste money on cooking classes when you could be earning a real degree." "It's not cooking classes," I tried to explain. "The Culinary Institute has one of the most rigorous programs in the country. Their graduates are sought after by restaurants worldwide." "Restaurants?" he scoffed, the word itself seeming distasteful in his mouth. "You want to spend your life in a hot kitchen, making minimum wage? That's your grand ambition?" The argument ended as most did in our house, with my father having the final word and my mother offering a sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful glance. The next day, I withdrew from business school, packed my belongings, and moved into a cramped apartment with 3 other aspiring chefs. If my parents wouldn't fund my education, I would do it myself. The next few years were a blur of exhaustion and determination. I worked as a dishwasher from 5 in the morning until noon, attended cooking classes until 6, then worked as a line cook until midnight. On weekends, I picked up catering gigs for extra cash. Sleep became a luxury, and social life non-existent. My hands developed calluses and burns that told the story of my dedication more eloquently than words ever could. You know, you can always come back home, finish your business degree, my mother suggested during one of our infrequent phone calls. Your father would help with tuition again if you chose a sensible path. This is my path, Mom, I insisted, too tired to argue but too passionate to surrender. I'm learning more in these kitchens than I ever did in a classroom. She sighed, that familiar sound of loving disappointment that had become the soundtrack of our relationship. I just worry about your future, Magnus. Restaurants fail all the time. What my family never understood was that I wasn't just learning to cook. I was learning an entire industry from the ground up. I knew how to fix industrial dishwashers when they broke down at midnight. I could calculate food costs and profit margins while prepping 100 pounds of vegetables. I understood the complex social ecosystem of a restaurant staff, from the temperamental executive chef to the servers dealing with difficult customers. By 25, I had worked every position possible in a restaurant. I had also saved almost nothing, living paycheck to paycheck despite working more hours than seemed humanly possible. My family's perception of my career choice had calcified into a mixture of pity and dismissal. At holiday gatherings, relatives would ask Natalie detailed questions about her cases while asking me if I was still doing that cooking thing. You're not getting any younger, my father reminded me during a particularly tense Thanksgiving dinner. When are you going to get serious about your life? Little did he know, I had never been more serious about anything. The turning point in my career came on a Tuesday night after a particularly brutal dinner service. I was wiping down the line, my body aching from a 12-hour shift, when the executive chef introduced me to a man named Anthony Russo. This is the guy I was telling you about, chef said, nodding in my direction. Hardest worker in the kitchen and has an actual palate, unlike these other clowns. Anthony was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the relaxed confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. He had owned restaurants in Chicago before moving to Seattle and was looking for new ventures. More importantly, he was looking for someone who understood both the culinary and business sides of restaurants. Chef tells me you have ideas, Anthony said, leaning against the counter. I'm interested in hearing them. That night, after everyone else had gone home, Anthony and I talked until the sun came up. I shared my vision for restaurants that honored ingredients while remaining accessible, places that treated staff with dignity instead of the toxic hierarchy that plagued the industry. Sustainable practices that would set new standards rather than following old ones. You think like an owner, not just a chef, Anthony said as we finally prepared to leave. That's rare. I think we could do something together. What began as mentorship evolved into partnership. Anthony became the first person who took my ambition seriously, who saw potential where my family saw only wasted talent. He taught me about investor relations, property leases, and the financial structures that could make or break a restaurant before the first meal was ever served. When my grandmother passed away a year later, she left me a modest inheritance of $40,000. It wasn't enough to buy a house or even pay off my student loans from the years before culinary school. But combined with Anthony's investment and a business plan that had been refined through countless late-night sessions, it was enough to lease a small space in an up-and-coming neighborhood. Harvest was born from 16-hour days, maxed-out credit cards, and more than a few nights spent sleeping on the office floor to save rent money. We opened with a staff of 8, a menu of 12 items that changed weekly based on local availability, and absolutely no safety net. The first 3 months were a lesson in stress management and creative problem-solving. When the refrigeration system failed 2 days before opening, I spent 24 hours straight working with a repairman to fix it. When our sous chef quit after a negative review, I worked both the line and expediting positions until we found a replacement. I learned that owning a restaurant meant being responsible for everything from broken toilets to customer complaints about the music volume. Every night, I would fall into bed exhausted, only to wake up 3 hours later with new menu ideas or solutions to staffing problems. The constant pressure should have been crushing, but instead, it felt like finally breathing with full lungs after years of shallow breaths. This is a phase, my father insisted when I missed a family function due to work. You'll burn out and come to your senses eventually. The breakthrough came 8 months after opening. A nationally renowned food critic visited Harvest unannounced and wrote a glowing review that described our humble restaurant as a revelation in honest cooking and the most exciting new establishment in the Pacific Northwest. Overnight, our reservation book filled for 3 months solid. Lines formed before opening, and food magazines began calling for interviews. When the review was published, I sent copies to my parents and Natalie. My mother called with genuine, if surprised, congratulations. My father noted that even a broken clock is right twice a day, implying my success was more luck than skill. Natalie sent a text saying, cute, right up. Let me know when you make the Forbes list like Dad. Their reactions stung, but by then, I had begun to build a new support system. The staff at Harvest had become a family of choice rather than birth. We celebrated wins together, supported each other through personal crises, and built something that mattered to all of us. When our first quarterly profit statement showed that we had finally moved into the black, we closed the restaurant for a night and had a party that lasted until dawn. Success, it turned out, was the best revenge against doubt. Within 3 years, Anthony and I had opened a second location, then a third. Each restaurant had a different concept but shared the same core values of quality, sustainability, and staff well-being. We implemented profit sharing for employees who stayed more than a year, paid living wages that were well above industry standard, and created health insurance options unheard of in most restaurants. While my business grew, my family's perception remained frozen in time. At a cousin's wedding, my father introduced me as Magnus. He runs some restaurants, then quickly changed the subject to Natalie's recent courtroom victory. My mother would occasionally mention seeing my name in local publications, but always with an air of surprise, as if my success was a continuous shock rather than the result of years of deliberate work. Natalie was perhaps the most frustrating. As my restaurants gained recognition, her dismissal transformed into backhanded compliments. I hear your little restaurant is quite popular with the hipster crowd, she remarked at a family gathering. It must be nice having such a simple business model. My work is so complex, sometimes I envy your straightforward life. She and my parents had never dined at any of my restaurants despite multiple invitations. There always seemed to be a convenient excuse, a scheduling conflict, or suddenly remembered dietary restriction. Their absence was a persistent reminder that in their eyes, I remained the family disappointment, regardless of external validation. The most significant expansion of my restaurant group came quietly, without the usual press releases and social media announcements. Castello was an institution in Seattle, an upscale Italian restaurant that had been serving the city's elite for over 30 years. The original owner was retiring, and through Anthony's connections, we learned the restaurant was for sale before it hit the market. Castello held special significance for me. It was where I had worked as a busboy during high school, where I had first fallen in love with the orchestrated chaos of fine dining. The opportunity to own it felt like the closing of a perfect circle. The purchase was completed with a handshake deal and a promise to maintain the restaurant's legacy. We kept the name, the core menu, and most importantly, the staff who had built its reputation for excellence. The only people who knew about the ownership change were management and key staff members. To everyone else, including my family, Castello continued as it always had. A Seattle landmark, with new energy but the same soul. I never mentioned the acquisition to my family. After years of dismissal, I had learned that seeking their approval was a path to guaranteed disappointment. Instead, I channeled my energy into making Castello even more successful, updating systems while respecting traditions, and ensuring that the restaurant would continue to create memorable experiences for another 30 years. Little did I know that my silent ownership of Castello would soon collide with my family's perception of me in a way that would change our dynamic forever. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning as I was reviewing staffing schedules for the week. Mom's 60th birthday celebration. Read the subject line from Natalie's account. I hesitated before opening it, bracing myself for whatever passive-aggressive communication awaited inside. Family dinner for Mom's 60th, the message began. Saturday, the 15th of September, at 7 p.m., at Castello. Formal attire required. Please confirm attendance by responding to this email. No warm greeting, no personal touch, just Natalie's typically efficient communication style. Yet despite the coldness of the invitation, I felt a spark of genuine excitement at the prospect of celebrating my mother's milestone birthday. Despite our complicated relationship, I loved her deeply and wanted to honor her properly. The irony of being invited to dine at my own restaurant as a guest was not lost on me. For a moment, I considered responding with this information, imagining the shock it might cause. But 60 years of my mother's life deserved better than family drama, and I decided that keeping my ownership private was the wisest course for her sake. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie before I could even respond to the email. "Make sure you dress appropriately," it read. "Dad's law partners will be there. And please arrive on time for once." I typed and deleted several responses before settling on a simple, "Looking forward to it. I'll be there." Her immediate reply stung more than it should have. "Try to remember this is about Mom, not an opportunity for you to network with restaurant people." The implication that I would somehow use my mother's birthday for professional gain was so typical of Natalie's perception of me that I had to laugh. But beneath the humor was a familiar ache, the persistent hope that someday my family might see me clearly instead of through the distorted lens they had created years ago. I called Ricardo, the manager at Castello, who had stayed on after my acquisition, to explain the situation. "My family is coming for my mother's birthday dinner on Saturday," I told him. "They don't know I own the restaurant, and I'd prefer to keep it that way for the evening." "Of course, Mr. Magnus," Ricardo replied, professional as always. "How would you like us to address you during the evening?" "Just treat me like any other guest," I said after a moment's consideration. "I don't want to create any drama during my mother's celebration." "Understood, sir." "Will you be making any special requests for the menu?" "No. Let them order whatever they like. Just make sure everything is perfect, as always." In the days leading up to the dinner, I found myself unexpectedly nervous. Family gatherings always carried an undercurrent of tension, but this one felt particularly significant. Perhaps it was the milestone nature of the birthday, or perhaps it was the unique circumstance of hosting them unknowingly in my own establishment. Whatever the reason, I found myself putting extraordinary thought into preparation. For my mother's gift, I tracked down a first edition of the vintage cookbook she had often mentioned loving as a young woman. It had been out of print for decades, but through connections in the culinary world, I located a copy in remarkably good condition. I had it professionally restored and rebound, then added a personal inscription, thanking her for first introducing me to the joy of cooking, even if she never intended it to become my life's work. The evening of the dinner, I dressed with particular care, selecting a charcoal gray suit that was elegant without being flashy. As I adjusted my tie, I caught myself rehearsing conversations in my head, preparing responses to the inevitable questions and comments about my career that would arise. "Tonight is about Mom," I reminded my reflection. Not about proving anything to anyone. The drive to Castello was filled with memories of cooking alongside my mother as a child. Despite her practical concerns about my career choice, she had been the one who first showed me how to knead dough and taught me to taste as I cooked. Her birthday felt like an opportunity to honor that connection, regardless of what had come after. Arriving at the restaurant, I experienced the strange sensation of being both owner and guest simultaneously. The valet who took my keys gave a subtle nod of recognition. The hostess greeted me with the perfect balance of respect and discretion. Walking through the dining room toward the private area reserved for our party, I noticed several staff members glancing in my direction, clearly curious about how the evening would unfold. Ricardo intercepted me near the bar, ostensibly to take my coat but actually to have a private word. "Everything is prepared exactly as usual, sir," he murmured. "The private dining room is ready, and staff have been instructed to treat all members of your party with extra attention." "Thank you, Ricardo," I replied quietly. "Remember, just Magnus tonight. No special treatment." He nodded, understanding the delicate situation perfectly. "Of course. Your sister arrived 20 minutes ago and has been quite specific about her expectations for the evening." "I'm sure she has," I said with a smile that contained more resignation than humor. "I'll handle it from here." With a deep breath, I stepped into the private dining room, ready to play my role as just another family member, rather than the man who signed everyone's paychecks. The charade had begun. The private dining room at Castello was transformed for the occasion, with arrangements of my mother's favorite lilies on every surface and soft lighting that flattered everyone present. About 20 people had already arrived, a mixture of family members and my parents' closest friends. My mother sat at the center of attention, elegant in a midnight blue dress. Looking genuinely happy to be surrounded by loved ones. She spotted me immediately, her face lighting up in a way that momentarily erased the tension I carried. "Magnus, you made it." She stood to embrace me, and I was struck by how small she felt in my arms, how the passage of time had gradually reshaped her, without my fully noticing. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said, kissing her cheek. "You look beautiful." My father approached with considerably less enthusiasm, offering a firm handshake and a perfunctory, "Son, good to see you made it on time." His tone suggested genuine surprise at this basic accomplishment. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, choosing to ignore the subtle dig. "60 looks good on you too, Dad." The joke fell flat, as most did between us. Before the conversation could deteriorate further, I was rescued by my Aunt Claire, who pulled me into a warm hug and immediately began asking about my life with genuine interest. She had always been something of an ally, perhaps because her own son had also chosen an unconventional career path as a wildlife photographer. "Your restaurants are getting quite the reputation," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "I read that piece about you in Seattle magazine. Why didn't you tell us you were doing so well?" I shrugged, uncomfortable with discussing my success in this setting. "It's been a busy few years. How's Mark doing with his photography?" The deflection worked, and soon she was showing me photos from her son's recent expedition to Alaska. Our conversation was interrupted by the distinct sound of a knife tapping against a glass. Natalie stood at the head of the main table, commanding attention as effortlessly as she did in a courtroom. "Now that everyone has arrived," she announced, with a pointed glance in my direction despite my punctuality, "we should take our seats for dinner. I've arranged a seating plan to facilitate conversation." She began directing people to their places, with the precision of an air traffic controller. Mom and Dad at the center, of course. Uncle Robert and Aunt Jane to Dad's right, the Sullivans next to them. She continued around the table, naming each person and their assigned seat. As the room arranged itself according to her instructions, I remained standing, waiting for my name to be called. The table filled until only one seat remained empty, to the left of my mother. A perfect position that would have allowed me to spend the evening actually connecting with the woman we were supposed to be celebrating. "Excuse me," I said, when Natalie had finished without mentioning me. "Where would you like me to sit?" The smile she gave me was sweet on the surface but laced with something darker. "Oh, Magnus, I thought you would be more comfortable at the service table." She gestured toward a smaller table in the corner where the servers typically staged water pitchers and extra place settings. "After all, you spend so much time in restaurants. You should sit with the staff. That's where you belong." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Several relatives suddenly became intensely interested in their napkins or water glasses. My father cleared his throat, but said nothing. My mother's face showed a flash of distress before smoothing into a neutral expression, her decades of peacekeeping between her children visibly at war with her desire not to cause a scene at her own birthday. In that moment, I felt the weight of years of similar humiliations, small and large. The countless times my achievements had been minimized, my passion dismissed as frivolous, the family gatherings where I had been introduced as an afterthought, while Natalie's accomplishments were celebrated at length. The persistent message that my chosen path somehow made me less worthy of respect or consideration. A hot flash of anger rose within me, words of confrontation building in my throat. But looking at my mother's face, seeing her silently pleading for harmony on her special night, I swallowed them back. This was not the time or place to finally stand up for myself, not when doing so would only create the kind of scene that would ruin her birthday. "Of course," I said quietly, forcing a smile. "Whatever makes the most sense for the table arrangement." I walked to the small service table with as much dignity as I could muster, feeling the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on my back. 2 young servers stood nearby, looking mortified at the situation. They had undoubtedly been told to set up a place for me at their station, and were now witnessing the humiliation of someone they knew to be their employer. "Sir," one of them whispered anxiously as I approached, "we can set another place at the main table. There's plenty of room." "It's fine, Michael," I assured him quietly. "Let's not make a scene. Just bring me the same courses as everyone else, please." "Yes, sir," he replied, his discomfort palpable. As the first course was served, I watched my family from a distance that was physical and symbolic. Natalie held court at the table, occasionally glancing in my direction with poorly concealed satisfaction. My father launched into stories about his recent legal victories, while various relatives discussed their children's college acceptances and promotions. From my isolated position, I had a unique vantage point on the restaurant operations that would normally have been fascinating. I could observe the precision of the service, the careful timing of courses, the subtle communication between staff members that created a seamless dining experience. On any other night, I would have been taking mental notes, looking for ways to further refine our systems. But tonight, all I felt was a profound sense of disconnection. The very success that I had built, the restaurant that now hosted my family in luxury, remained invisible to them. They enjoyed the benefits of my expertise and hard work, without the slightest recognition of its source. The irony was almost too perfect, a metaphor made manifest in the most painful way possible. As the main course arrived, my cousin Thomas approached my table, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but decent enough to acknowledge it. "This is ridiculous," he said, nodding toward the main table. "Want me to say something to Natalie?" I shook my head. "Thanks. But no. It would just create drama for Mom. I'm fine here. Really, you're a better person than I am," he replied. "If it helps, some of us have noticed how well you're doing. My wife and I had dinner at your downtown place last month. It was incredible." His kindness was a small bright spot in an otherwise dismal evening. We chatted briefly before he returned to the main table, leaving me once again to my isolation. As the dinner progressed, I focused on the few moments of genuine connection I managed to have when relatives would approach between courses, often apologetically, to have brief conversations. Throughout it all, I maintained a calm exterior while internally counting the minutes until I could leave without appearing rude. The staff, aware of my true position, treated me with a subtle deference that thankfully went unnoticed by my family. Several times I caught Ricardo watching the situation with growing concern, and I gave him reassuring nods to prevent any well-intentioned intervention. What I didn't realize was that the evening was about to take an unexpected turn, one that not even Natalie's careful planning could have anticipated. The dessert course was being prepared when the private dining room door opened to admit an unexpected visitor. Franco Passerini, the elderly former owner of Castello, who had sold me the restaurant, but remained a frequent and honored guest, entered with his characteristic flair. Though I had bought the restaurant from him, we had developed a friendship, and he often stopped by unannounced when dining with friends in the main restaurant. Franco was in his 70s, with a full head of silver hair and the bearing of European aristocracy. He spotted me immediately, his bushy eyebrows rising in surprise at seeing me seated away from the main party. Before Ricardo could intercept him with an explanation of the delicate situation, Franco was striding across the room toward me, arms outstretched. "Magnus, my boy," he exclaimed in his booming Italian accent. "What are you doing sitting back here in your own restaurant? Is something wrong with the big table?" The room went silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned first to Franco, then to me, confusion evident on every face. Natalie froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips. "Hello, Franco," I said, standing to embrace him. "Just a family gathering. My mother's birthday." I nodded toward the main table where my mother was watching with wide eyes. Franco turned to the assembled family, beaming with pride. "You must be the mother of this brilliant young man. What a pleasure to meet you. You have raised an extraordinary son, the best restaurateur in Seattle." Ricardo appeared at my side, clearly trying to assess whether intervention was needed. Franco noticed him and continued enthusiastically. "Ricardo, why is the boss sitting back here like a stranger? This is not right. Magnus, your table should be at the head, not hidden away like this." "Franco," I began, but it was too late. The revelation was complete, hanging in the air for everyone to process. "Boss?" my father repeated, looking between Franco and me with narrowed eyes. "What is he talking about, Magnus?" Before I could formulate a response that might minimize the dramatic shift in the room's atmosphere, Ricardo stepped forward. Years of professional discretion apparently gave way to a sense of justice I hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Magnus is the owner of Castello, he stated clearly, and 4 other restaurants in the city. He acquired this establishment 3 years ago and has elevated it to new heights of excellence while respecting its traditions. We are honored to serve his family tonight. The silence that followed was profound. I watched the information ripple through the room, transforming expressions from confusion to shock to, in some cases, embarrassment. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise, and something that looked remarkably like pride. Natalie recovered first, her legal training kicking in to manage the unexpected. "That's impossible," she said dismissively. "Magnus works in restaurants. He doesn't own them, especially not one like this." She laughed, though the sound held no humor. "There must be some misunderstanding." Franco's eyebrows shot up even further. "Misunderstanding? No. I sold this restaurant to Magnus myself. Signed the papers in this very room. He owns not just Castello but Harvest, Ember, Tide, and that new place downtown. What is it called? Ricardo? Provisions, sir," Ricardo supplied. "Yes, Provisions. The one with the 3-month waiting list for reservations." Franco clapped me on the shoulder. "Your son is a very important man in this city. Very respected in the culinary world." The staff members present, who had been maintaining professional composure despite the uncomfortable situation, now stood a little straighter. One of the servers, who had been attending my isolated table, stepped forward. "Mr. Magnus is the best boss I've ever had," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He knows every employee by name. He helped pay for my culinary school tuition." Another server nodded. "When my daughter was in the hospital last year, he covered all the medical bills that insurance wouldn't pay." The spontaneous testimonials continued, each one revealing aspects of my business and character that I had never shared with my family. Not out of secrecy, but because they had never shown interest enough to ask. Natalie's expression shifted from disbelief to something more complex, a mixture of shock and the dawning realization that she had badly miscalculated the evening's power dynamic. My father sat perfectly still, his face unreadable except for a muscle twitching in his jaw. Around them, relatives and friends exchanged glances. The evening suddenly transformed into something entirely unexpected. I cleared my throat, acutely aware that all attention was now focused on me. "I had hoped to keep this a private family celebration without bringing business into it," I said, directing my words primarily to my mother. "Tonight is about Mom, not me or my restaurants." My mother stood slowly, her eyes never leaving my face. "Magnus, why didn't you tell us?" The question contained years of missed connections and assumptions, of conversations that should have happened but never did. I could have responded with justifiable anger or righteous vindication. Instead, I chose honesty. "Would it have mattered?" I asked softly. "Would it have changed how you see what I do?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable in its directness. My mother's expression crumpled slightly, the truth of it clearly hitting home. Franco, bless his lack of social subtlety, broke the tension by clapping his hands together. "Well, this calls for a celebration. Ricardo, bring the special reserve Barolo from my personal collection, and tell Chef Antonio to prepare his special tartufo dessert for everyone." Ricardo nodded, visibly relieved to have a task that took him away from the charged atmosphere. The staff, taking cues from his departure, discreetly began moving about the room again, refilling water glasses and clearing plates with renewed efficiency. I found myself at a crossroads. I could continue allowing the evening to unfold in this awkward limbo, or I could take control of the situation. After years of accepting my family's perception of me, the choice suddenly seemed clear. "Franco's right," I said, my voice stronger now. "This is a celebration. Mom's 60th birthday deserves the very best Castello has to offer." I turned to Ricardo, who had returned with remarkable speed. "Please have the kitchen prepare a selection of our signature dishes for the table to share. And bring a chair to the main table, if you would." "Of course, sir," Ricardo replied, the barest hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. As staff hurried to accommodate my requests, I moved toward the main table. Natalie watched my approach, with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, somewhere between defensiveness and shock. The empty chair was placed beside my mother, in the position that should have been mine from the beginning. I believe this seat was meant for family, I said quietly. Meeting Natalie's eyes directly, she had the grace to look away first. As I took my seat beside my mother, the dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably. Family members who had barely acknowledged me earlier now leaned forward eagerly, full of questions about my restaurants and career. My father maintained a stoic silence, but I caught him watching me with an intensity that suggested internal recalibration. The kitchen, clearly determined to showcase their best work for the owner's family, began sending out course after course of exquisite dishes not on the regular menu. Each plate arrived with theatrical presentation, the chef personally describing his creations with reverent detail. Wine pairings appeared as if by magic, each selection more rare and perfectly matched than the last. Through it all, I maintained the calm confidence that running successful businesses had taught me. I answered questions thoughtfully, deflected praise graciously, and kept redirecting attention to my mother whenever possible. This was still her night. Even if circumstances had forced an unexpected spotlight onto me, what had begun as an evening of isolation had transformed into something I couldn't have anticipated. The public recognition of my achievements by the very people whose approval I had stopped seeking years ago. The irony was not lost on me, nor was the complicated mix of emotions it produced. Vindication, certainly, but also a wistfulness for all the years of connection lost to misunderstanding and assumption. As the evening progressed, I caught my mother watching me with a new expression, one that contained pride, regret, and something that looked remarkably like awe. The power dynamic that had defined our family for decades had shifted permanently, and none of us were quite sure yet what would take its place. As dessert concluded and guests began mingling around the room, Natalie approached me at the bar where I had gone for a moment of quiet reflection. Her expression was guarded, her body language stiff with discomfort. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual authoritative edge. I nodded, gesturing to a quiet corner away from the rest of the party. For a moment, we stood in awkward silence, the weight of the evening's revelations hanging between us. "So," she finally began, "you own Costello, and apparently several other restaurants." "Yes," I replied simply, offering no elaboration. After years of explaining and justifying myself to my family, I felt no obligation to fill this particular silence. She shifted her weight, fidgeting with her watch in a nervous gesture I recognized from childhood. "Why didn't you say anything when I suggested this place for Mom's birthday? Or when I—" She trailed off, unable to directly reference her attempt at humiliation. "When you seated me with the staff?" I finished for her. "Would it have changed anything if I had told you? Or would you have just found another way to make your point about where you think I belong in the family hierarchy?" The directness of my question seemed to catch her off guard. Natalie was accustomed to controlling conversations, to never being called to account for her behavior so explicitly. "That's not fair," she protested, though without her usual conviction. "I was just trying to arrange the seating in a way that made sense for the important guests." "And I wasn't an important guest at our mother's birthday?" I asked quietly. "Be honest, Natalie. Not with me, but with yourself. This wasn't about seating arrangements." She looked away, her gaze fixing on some distant point across the room. "You've always been the favorite," she said suddenly, her voice almost inaudible. "What?" I couldn't have been more surprised by her words if she had suddenly started speaking in tongues. "Mom always defended you, always made excuses for you dropping out of business school, for your alternative career path. Dad pushed you because he saw potential in you. With me, it was always just expected that I would succeed. There was never any other option." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by this revelation. "Natalie, they've spent my entire life comparing me unfavorably to you. You were the golden child, the one who did everything right. I was the disappointment." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her. "Is that what you think? God, Magnus, I had to fight for every scrap of approval. You got it, just for existing." For perhaps the first time in our adult lives, we really looked at each other, seeing past the calcified roles we had assumed for so long. I realized with startling clarity that we had both been playing parts in a family dynamic neither of us had created, but both had perpetuated. We've been competing for approval that shouldn't be conditional, I said slowly. Mom and Dad set us against each other. Maybe without even realizing it. Natalie was silent for a long moment, her legal mind visibly processing this new perspective. I don't know how to be anything other than the successful daughter, she finally admitted. It's been my identity for so long, and I've been the rebellious son with something to prove, I acknowledged. Even when I stopped trying to earn their approval, I was still defining myself in opposition to their expectations. We stood in silence again, but this time it felt less hostile, more contemplative. Decades of misunderstanding couldn't be resolved in a single conversation. But perhaps we had opened a door that had long been closed between us. Your restaurants, she said finally. They're really successful, aren't they? Not just trendy places, but actual sustainable businesses, I nodded. 5 locations, over 200 employees, and consistent growth even during economic downturns. We're expanding to Portland next year. A hint of genuine respect flickered across her features. That's impressive, Magnus. Truly, thank you, I said, the words feeling strange but welcome. Your career is impressive too, Natalie. I've always known that. Even when it was being used as a measuring stick against me, she flinched slightly at that but didn't deny it. Maybe we could have dinner sometime, at one of your other restaurants. I'd like to see what you've built. I'd like that, I replied, surprised to find I actually meant it. Our conversation was interrupted by my father approaching, his expression suggesting he had been working himself up to this moment for some time. Natalie gave me a look that contained equal parts warning and curiosity before excusing herself. Son, my father began stiffly. I understand. Congratulations are in order. Coming from him, it was a monumental acknowledgement, however grudgingly delivered. I accepted it with a nod, waiting to see what would follow. Your restaurants, he continued, clearly uncomfortable but pressing on. They're doing well financially? Of course, his first question would be about money rather than passion or fulfillment. Some things never changed. Very well, I confirmed. The restaurant group has shown consistent profitability for the past 5 years, with year-over-year growth averaging 22%. He blinked, visibly processing this information through his framework of what constituted success. And Costello? This place must have been a significant investment. It was, I agreed. But it returned the initial investment within 18 months, which is almost unheard of in the restaurant industry. A flicker of something that might have been respect crossed his features. I had no idea, he said finally. You never talked about the business side of your career. You never asked, I pointed out, keeping my tone neutral rather than accusatory. You assumed I was just cooking for a living, not building a company. He had the grace to look slightly abashed, though his natural defenses quickly reasserted themselves. Well, you weren't exactly forthcoming about your successes. I could have pointed out the many times I had tried to share news about restaurant openings or positive reviews only to have the subject quickly changed. I could have reminded him of the invitations to dine at my establishments that had been declined or ignored. Instead, I chose to focus on the present moment and its potential. I'm not interested in assigning blame, Dad, I said honestly. What matters is where we go from here. If you're interested in understanding what I've built, I'm happy to share that with you. He nodded slowly, his expression suggesting internal calculations were taking place. Perhaps I could visit your flagship location sometime. Get a tour of the operation. It wasn't quite an apology, or even a full acknowledgement of his dismissal over the years, but from my father, it represented a significant concession. I accepted it for what it was, a small opening that might eventually lead to something more substantial. I'd be happy to show you around Harvest, I told him. It's where everything started, he nodded again, seemingly having reached the limit of his emotional capacity for one conversation. With a somewhat awkward pat on my shoulder, he moved away to join a group of his law partners. Throughout the remainder of the evening, I had similar conversations with various family members, some genuinely curious about my work, others clearly reassessing their perception of me in light of the evening's revelations. But the most meaningful exchange came when I finally had a moment alone with my mother. She found me on the small terrace attached to the private dining room, where I had stepped out for a breath of fresh air. The September evening was unusually clear for Seattle, with stars visible above the city lights. "There you are," she said, joining me at the railing. "Hiding from your own party? It's your party," I reminded her with a smile. "I'm just the unexpected entertainment." She laughed softly, then fell silent, looking out at the city skyline. "I should have known," she said finally. "About your success, your restaurants. A mother should know these things about her son." "I tried to tell you," I said gently. "Many times." She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know. I just didn't listen properly. I was so busy worrying about whether you would be okay that I missed seeing that you already were. More than okay." "Why did you worry so much?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Even when I was clearly building something successful, you never seemed to fully believe in it." She sighed, her fingers tracing patterns on the stone railing. "My father was an artist," she said, surprising me with this rarely mentioned aspect of family history. Talented, passionate, absolutely committed to his work. He died young, leaving my mother with 3 children and no financial security. I watched her struggle for years to keep us afloat. She turned to face me directly. "When you showed the same creative spark, the same disregard for conventional security, I panicked. I pushed you toward what I thought was safety because I was terrified you'd end up leaving a family vulnerable the way my father did. It was never about not believing in you, Magnus. It was about my own fears." The revelation hit me with unexpected force. All these years, I had interpreted her lack of support as disappointment or dismissal, when it had been rooted in love and fear. Misguided, perhaps, but coming from a place of genuine concern rather than rejection. "Mom," I said, taking her hands in mine, "you should see my restaurants. Really see them. The people who work there. The community we've built. It's not just about food. It's about creating something sustainable, something that supports dozens of families and brings joy to thousands of people." "I'd like that," she said, squeezing my hands. "I'd like to really understand what you've created. I'm sorry it took me so long to be ready for that." "Better late than never," I told her, pulling her into a gentle hug. "And Mom, thank you for teaching me to cook all those years ago. It all started with you, even if neither of us knew where it would lead." She laughed through her tears, holding me tightly. "My son, the restaurant owner. Who would have thought?" "I would have," I said simply. "I always knew exactly where I was headed, even when no one else could see it." We returned to the party together. Something fundamental shifted between us. The evening concluded with the presentation of a special dessert I had secretly arranged with the pastry chef, a recreation of the simple spice cake my mother used to make for birthdays when we were children, elevated with professional technique, but instantly recognizable to her. As she blew out the candles, surrounded by family and friends, I caught her eye across the table. The smile she gave me contained recognition, pride, and the promise of a new chapter in our relationship, one based on who we truly were rather than who we had assumed each other to be. The days following my mother's birthday dinner brought changes I couldn't have anticipated. The first surprise came in the form of a text message from my mother the very next morning. "I couldn't sleep last night thinking about all the times I should have celebrated your passion instead of worrying about it. I am so proud of the man you've become, Magnus. Prouder than I can say." Her words, simple but profound, began a healing process I hadn't realized I needed so desperately. For decades, I had convinced myself that family approval was unnecessary, that I had moved beyond needing their validation. The wave of emotion that her message triggered revealed the lie in that belief. We never entirely outgrow the desire to be seen and valued by those who raised us, no matter how independent we become. 3 days after the dinner, an email arrived from Natalie. Unlike her usual communications, this one started with "Dear Magnus," rather than launching directly into business. "I've been reflecting on our conversation and my behavior over the years," she wrote. "While I still believe some of my perceptions about family dynamics were valid, I can see now that I've often treated you unfairly out of my own insecurities. The seat at the staff table was inexcusable. Regardless of what I knew or didn't know about your professional success, I am sorry for that, and for many other moments when competition replaced what should have been support between siblings. Her apology, though careful and somewhat qualified, represented more vulnerability than Natalie had shown in our entire adult relationship. I appreciated both the effort it must have taken to write and the honesty it contained. Progress between us would come in small steps rather than dramatic transformations, but at least we were finally moving forward, rather than remaining locked in childhood patterns. Perhaps the most unexpected development came a week later, when my father called to ask if his standing invitation for a tour of Harvest was still open. His voice held an unfamiliar note of hesitation, almost humility, as he suggested a time that would work with his schedule. "I'd like to understand what you've built," he said. "Really understand it. Not just the financial aspects." The tour that followed was initially awkward, with my father visibly uncomfortable in the bustling restaurant environment. But as I walked him through each aspect of the operation, from the relationships with local farmers to the apprenticeship program for disadvantaged youth, I watched his perception visibly shift. By the time we reached the kitchen, where lunch service was in full swing, he was asking genuinely interested questions and observing the orchestrated chaos with newfound respect. "It's like a law firm," he commented, watching the communication between line cooks, expediter, and servers. "Everyone has their role, their expertise. It's a professional operation." "That's exactly right," I agreed, pleased by the comparison. Different field, same principles of excellence and specialization. When he joined me for a meal after the tour, sitting at the chef's table with a view of the entire kitchen, I noticed him watching me interact with staff with an expression I'd rarely seen directed my way. "Pride, you're good at this," he said simply, as we finished our meal. "Not just the cooking, the leadership, the vision. I didn't see it before, but I see it now." From my father, those words were equivalent to a standing ovation. The weeks following brought a gradual restructuring of family relationships. My mother began a tradition of Sunday brunch at whichever of my restaurants she hadn't yet visited, slowly working her way through each location with genuine curiosity and appreciation. Sometimes my father joined her, sometimes Natalie, occasionally both. These brunches became a space for conversation that had been missing for decades, allowing us to rediscover each other as the adults we had become rather than the roles we had once played. Not every relationship within the family healed at the same pace. Some relatives continued to treat my career as a curious oddity rather than a legitimate achievement. My uncle Robert, my father's brother and a surgeon, still made comments about real professions at family gatherings. I learned to accept that some perspectives would never fully change and to find peace with that limitation. The experience changed me professionally as well as personally. I had always valued my staff, but the evening of my mother's birthday had shown me just how much they valued me. In return, their spontaneous defense of my character in that moment of revelation had touched me deeply. In response, I expanded the profit-sharing program to include all employees who had been with the company for at least 6 months, rather than the previous 1-year requirement. I established a formal tuition assistance program named after Michael, the server who had been so concerned about my treatment at the birthday dinner and who, I learned, had been taking business classes at night while working full-time. Perhaps most significantly, I began mentoring young chefs who faced family resistance to their culinary ambitions. Having navigated that difficult path myself, I could offer both practical guidance and emotional support to those whose passion was dismissed by those closest to them. Watching these young people grow in confidence and skill became one of the most rewarding aspects of my career. On a personal level, the events of that evening forced me to confront wounds I had been carrying since childhood. With the encouragement of Anthony, who had witnessed my struggle with family dynamics for years, I began working with a therapist who specialized in adult family relationships. "You can't change the past," she told me during our first session, "but you can change how much power it has over your present and future." Those words became a touchstone as I worked through layers of hurt, expectation, and assumption that had accumulated over decades. I learned to recognize when I was reacting to old patterns rather than current reality, to set boundaries that protected my well-being, while still allowing for connection. And most importantly, to separate my sense of worth from external validation. The most profound life lesson from the entire experience was one I found myself sharing with the young chefs I mentored. Success is ultimately the best response to doubt, but validation must first come from within. For years, I had built restaurants hoping on some level to prove my family wrong. The irony was that only when I fully believed in my own path, regardless of their opinion, did they finally begin to see its value. I also came to understand that family relationships exist on a spectrum rather than in absolute terms. Perfect reconciliation was an unrealistic goal. What mattered was finding a balance that allowed for authentic connection while acknowledging the limitations of each relationship. With Natalie, this meant occasional dinners where we carefully avoided certain topics. With my father, it meant conversations focused primarily on business, but conducted with newfound respect. With my mother, it opened the door to a deeper relationship than we had ever managed before. The truth I eventually embraced was that family can be both those we are born to and those we choose. The community I had built through my restaurants, the staff who had become friends and confidants, the mentees who looked to me for guidance, all formed a family of choice that complemented and sometimes compensated for the limitations of my family of birth. 6 months after my mother's birthday dinner, I opened a small culinary school in a disadvantaged neighborhood, offering free training to young people who showed passion but lacked resources. The first class included 16 students, each with dreams as vivid as mine had been at their age. On the wall of the main teaching kitchen, I hung a simple plaque with words I wished someone had said to me years ago. Your passion is not a detour from success. It is the road. When my cookbook was published the following year, I dedicated it to my mother, who taught me that cooking is an act of love, even when she worried it shouldn't be a career. The inscription brought tears to her eyes at the launch party, which the entire family attended, sitting together at one table without assigned seating or hidden tensions. The restaurant where my sister once seated me with the staff has become a family gathering place for celebrations and Sunday brunches. Ricardo still manages it with impeccable professionalism, though now he greets all members of my family by name and with genuine warmth. The staff table where I once sat in isolation has been removed, the space reconfigured to create a more inclusive dining environment. If you've stayed with my story this long, maybe you're wondering what happened with Natalie. We're still works in progress, she and I. Some days we connect as the adults we've become. Other days we slip back into the competitive siblings we once were. But we're trying. And that effort itself represents a victory over the past. The journey from that humiliating moment at my mother's birthday to where I stand today taught me that true success isn't measured by restaurants owned or accolades received, but by the courage to follow your own path and the wisdom to help others find theirs. Family approval is sweet when it comes, but it cannot be the foundation on which we build our lives. That foundation must be our own conviction, our own belief in the value of our dreams. Have you ever had someone dismiss your passion only to change their tune when success arrived? Or found family in unexpected places when blood relatives couldn't see your vision? Drop a comment below and share your experience. Like this video if my story resonated with you. Subscribe to hear more stories of triumph over family doubt. And share with someone who might need to be reminded that their dreams are valid, regardless of who believes in them. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, sometimes the people who know you longest are the last to see who you've truly become.